They say that in the hierarchy of the pack, your bloodline is your destiny. If you are born strong, you rule. If you are born weak, you serve. Zella had accepted her place at the bottom, an invisible shadow in a world of predators, grateful for the crumbs of affection she could find. She believed that losing the boy she loved was the absolute worst tragedy that could befall her, a final nail in the coffin of her happiness. She was wrong. That heartbreak was merely the clearing of the board, the violent sweeping away of a pawn to make room for a queen. Because in a world where she was forbidden from rising, the only one who didn't care about the rules was the one man who wrote them, the Alpha King. Chapter 1. The words hung in the space between them, heavy and suffocating. Like a physical weight that pressed down on Zella's chest until breathing felt like a labor she wasn't sure she wanted to complete. Hati stood 5 feet away, his posture rigid, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his denim jacket. He wouldn't look at her. That was the first sign that the world was ending. Hati, who had spent the last 2 years chasing her smile, now found the gravel beneath his boots infinitely more interesting than the tears gathering in her eyes. "You're not listening, Zella," Hati said, his voice rough, lacking the warmth she had grown addicted to. He kicked a loose stone, sending it skittering across the pavement of the old parking lot behind the community center. "It's not about us. It's about the future. It's about logic." "Logic?" Zella repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold her shattering pieces together. The wind bit at her exposed skin, a cruel reminder that winter was coming, but the chill radiating from him was far worse. "We've been together for 2 years, Hati. You told me I was your balance. You said I was the only one who understood you." "I did," he admitted, finally lifting his gaze. His eyes, usually a warm hazel, were cold and guarded. "And you do understand me. That's why you have to get this. The beta position is opening up next spring. My father expects me to take it. The pack expects me to take it." "And you think I'll stop you?" Zella asked, her voice trembling. "I've never held you back. I've supported every patrol, every training session." "It's not about what you do, Zella. It's about who you are," Hati interrupted. The cruelty of the statement landing with the precision of a sniper's bullet. He took a breath, steeling himself. "You're an orphan with no lineage. Your parents were nobodies. Your aunts barely acknowledge you exist. If I want to stand beside the Alpha one day, I need a mate who brings something to the table. Status, alliances, strength." Zella felt the blood drain from her face. It was the unspoken truth she had spent her entire life trying to outrun, that in this pack, she was nothing more than a placeholder. "So that's it? I'm just a liability?" "I met someone," Hati blurted out, ripping the bandage off before the wound could even bleed properly. "Ilfa. Her father is Elder Rudina. She makes sense, Zella. She fits the picture." The name was a physical blow. Ilfa. Beautiful, high-born, cruel Ilfa. Of course. It was the perfect strategic move, a chess play that secured Hati's future while wiping Zella off the board completely. "I didn't want to hurt you," Hati added, his voice dropping to a whisper that sounded sickeningly like pity. "But I can't be sentimental, not if I want to lead. You deserve someone who can be happy with less." He turned his back then, the finality of the movement screaming louder than any shout. He walked away toward the tree line where the path led back to the affluent side of the village, leaving Zella standing alone on the cracked pavement. She didn't chase him. She knew better than to chase something that never really wanted to be caught. She simply stood there as the silence of the evening swallowed her whole, the realization settling in that she wasn't just single, she was discarded. And in a pack where connection was survival, Being discarded was a dangerous thing. The walk back to the pack house was a blur of gray scenery and muffled sounds. Zella moved on autopilot, her legs carrying her forward while her mind remained stuck in that parking lot, replaying the moment Hati's face had twisted with that awful, pragmatic resolve. As she entered the main territory, the bustle of pack life continued uninterrupted. Wolves sparred in the distant fields, their grunts and cheers drifting on the wind. Children chased each other around the communal fire pit, their laughter sharp and piercing. No one looked at her. This was the strange paradox of Zella's existence. She was entirely visible, yet completely unseen. She slipped through the back entrance of the housing unit she shared with her aunts. The kitchen was warm, smelling of roasted meat and herbs, a stark contrast to the hollow coldness inside her ribs. Her Aunt Mara was at the stove, stirring a large pot, while Aunt Sola sat at the table, polishing a set of silver ceremonial daggers. Neither woman looked up as the screen door slammed shut behind Zella. "You're late," Mara said. Not an accusation, just a statement of fact delivered with the same enthusiasm one might use to read a grocery list. "Dinner is in 10 minutes. Don't drag mud on the floor." "I'm not hungry," Zella murmured, keeping her head down as she moved toward the hallway. "Suit yourself," Sola muttered, blowing a speck of dust off the blade. "More for us. Just make sure the trash is out before morning." There was no question of "Are you okay?" or "Why are your eyes red?" To ask those questions would imply they cared about the answers. To her aunts, Zella was an obligation inherited from a sister who had the indecency to die young and leave a burden behind. Zella was a mouth to feed, a body to house, and nothing more. She wasn't treated with open malice. That would have at least been a form of passion, but with a crushing indifference that made her question if she was actually real. Zella reached her small room and closed the door, leaning her forehead against the wood. Hati's words echoed in the cramped space. "It's about who you are." She moved to her bedside table, her fingers trembling as she opened the drawer and pulled out her leather-bound journal. It was the only place where she was allowed to be loud, the only space where her thoughts didn't have to shrink to fit someone else's comfort. She needed to get out. The walls of the pack house, usually just stifling, now felt like they were closing in to crush her. She grabbed her worn coat, shoving the journal into the deep pocket. She couldn't stay here. If she stayed, she would scream, and screaming would draw attention, and attention was dangerous for a girl with no defenders. She needed the one place where the hierarchy didn't matter. Slipping back out the window to avoid her aunts, Zella sprinted toward the tree line. She ran past the training grounds where the elite wolves practiced their dominance. She ran past the grand houses of the elders. She didn't stop until the manicured paths turned into wild, overgrown trails. This was the forbidden edge of the territory, the deep woods where the patrols rarely bothered to check because nothing valuable was supposed to be there. It was her sanctuary. Here, the trees didn't care about her bloodline. The river didn't ask who her father was. Here, she could just be. But as she sank onto the mossy bank of the river, clutching her journal like a lifeline, she didn't realize that the deep woods held eyes other than those of the wild animals, eyes that belonged to a predator far more dangerous than any she had encountered before. High above the training grounds, on the sprawling stone balcony of the Alpha's estate, Fenrir stood like a statue carved from obsidian. The wind up here was stronger, whipping his dark hair across his forehead, but he didn't blink. His gaze was fixed not on the horizon, but on a scene playing out near the edge of the village. He watched as Alcide, one of his most trusted betas and closest friends, lifted a female wolf into the air, spinning her around while she laughed. The sound of her joy was faint from this distance, but the radiating contentment from Alcide's wolf was strong enough that Fenrir could practically taste it on the breeze. It was a cloying, sweet sense of completion. Alcide had found his mate 3 weeks ago, and ever since, the man had been walking around with a dopey, terrifyingly happy grin that made Fenrir want to punch him and congratulate him in equal measure. Fenrir turned away, his grip on the stone railing tightening until the rock groaned under the pressure. He wasn't jealous. Kings didn't get jealous. He was tired. Being the Alpha King wasn't about glory. It was about management. It was an endless parade of disputes, resource allocations, and navigating the fragile egos of the Council of Elders. Elder Rudina had been in his ear all morning, droning on about legacy and hinting not so subtly that it was time Fenrir chose a queen. The name Ylfa had been dropped into the conversation at least a dozen times, like a coin into a beggar's cup. The thought of Ylfa made Fenrir's wolf pace restlessly in the back of his mind. She was perfect on paper, strong lineage, politically savvy, beautiful in a sharp, manicured way. But she smelled like ambition and cold metal. There was no warmth there, no spark that made his wolf sit up and take notice. A union with her would be a merger, not a mating. "I need air," Fenrir muttered to the empty balcony. The estate felt like a cage today, gilded and velvet-lined, but a cage nonetheless. He vaulted over the railing, dropping 2 stories to the lush grass below with a silent, predatory grace. He needed to run, but shifting into his wolf form would draw attention. The pack would see the Alpha King prowling and assume there was a threat, sparking a panic he didn't have the energy to quell. So he walked. His long strides carried him away from the noise of the village, away from the cloying scent of Alcide's happiness, and away from the suffocating expectations of the council. He bypassed the usual patrol routes. He wanted silence. He wanted the kind of deep, untamed wild that reminded him he was an apex predator, not just a politician in a human skin. He pushed deeper into the forest, past the markers where the younger wolves stopped their games. The canopy grew thicker here, blocking out the dying light of the afternoon sun. The sounds of the pack faded, replaced by the rustle of dry leaves and the distant rush of water. Fenrir breathed in, finally letting his shoulders drop. This was better. This was real. But as he neared the river that marked the rough internal boundary of the deep woods, his wolf suddenly stopped pacing and froze. Fenrir paused, his head tilting to the side. The forest was supposed to be empty, yet a scent drifted toward him. It wasn't the smell of a threat, nor was it the smell of a rogue. It was something distinct, something laced with the salt of tears and the smell of old paper and ink. It was a scent of profound, aching sadness that tugged at his chest with a hook he hadn't expected. Curiosity, a sensation he hadn't felt in years, flickered to life. He moved forward, silent as a shadow, drawn toward the source of the sorrow. The forest floor was a carpet of damp moss and decaying leaves, absorbing the sound of Fenrir's heavy boots as he stalked through the underbrush. He moved with the natural stealth of a creature born to hunt, his breathing slow and controlled. The scent grew stronger with every step, a mix of rain, wildflowers, and that sharp, undeniable tang of heartbreak. It was a smell that triggered a protective instinct in his gut, confusing him. He was the Alpha King. He protected the pack as a collective entity. He did not investigate the emotional turmoil of individual wolves. Yet, here he was. He reached the edge of a small natural clearing bisected by the rushing river. The light here was dim, filtered through layers of green and gold. Fenrir stopped behind the trunk of a massive oak tree, using the shadows to cloak his presence. There, sitting on a large, flat rock that jutted out into the water, was a girl. She was small, not necessarily in stature, but in the way she held herself, curled inward as if trying to occupy the least amount of space possible. Her coat was threadbare, the cuffs frayed, marking her instantly as someone from the lower rungs of the pack's hierarchy. Her hair fell in a curtain around her face, obscuring her features, but he could see the tremor in her shoulders. She was writing furiously in a leather-bound book, her hand moving across the page with a desperate intensity, only stopping to wipe angrily at her cheeks. Fenrir watched, transfixed. He knew every high-ranking wolf in his territory. He knew the warriors, the politicians, the merchants. But he did not know her. She felt invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of his kingdom. "Why are you crying?" The question rose unbidden in his mind, as if she heard his thought. The girl lifted her head, looking out across the river. The movement allowed Fenrir to see her profile. Her face was tear-streaked, her eyes swollen, but there was a quiet devastation in her expression that hit him harder than a physical blow. She looked like someone who had been hollowed out, and then it happened. A breeze shifted, carrying her scent full force into his lungs. His wolf slammed against his ribcage, letting out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through Fenrir's very bones. It wasn't just a scent anymore. It was a command. Mine. Fenrir gripped the rough bark of the oak tree, his knuckles turning white. The reaction was visceral, instantaneous, and terrifying. He looked at this girl, this broken, weeping thing wearing rags, and saw something that eclipsed the sun. He saw a queen in the wreckage. He took a step forward, his boot snapping a dry twig with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet clearing. The girl's head snapped toward his direction, her eyes wide with sudden fear. She scrambled to close her journal, clutching it to her chest as she scanned the tree line. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling but laced with a surprising grit. Fenrir froze in the shadows. He could step out. He could walk into that light, pull her into his arms, and demand to know who had made her cry so he could dismantle them limb by limb. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to go to her, but he looked at the fear in her eyes, the look of a prey animal expecting a predator. She was already broken. If the Alpha King stepped out of the darkness now, looming over her with this sudden, intense possession, he wouldn't save her. He would terrify her. He forced himself to stay still, forced his breath to remain even, and watched from the darkness, a king brought to his knees by the sight of a girl who didn't even know she had been found. Chapter 2. 3 days had passed since the rejection in the parking lot, and Zella had spent every waking hour trying to make herself smaller. She moved through the pack house like a specter, avoiding the kitchen during mealtimes, and keeping her head lowered whenever she crossed paths with her aunts. But the silence of the house was loud with unspoken judgment, and the pity in the eyes of the few pack members who noticed her was worse than their scorn. She needed the river. She needed the only place where she felt like she occupied space without apology. The afternoon sun was hidden behind a quilt of steel-gray clouds as Zella crossed the boundary into the deep woods. Usually, the moment she stepped beneath the canopy, the tension in her shoulders would unspool. Today, however, the forest felt different. The air was heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on her arms stand up. The birds, usually a raucous chorus in the late afternoon, were unnervingly silent. Zella slowed her pace, clutching her journal against her chest. Her wolf, usually a dormant presence that mirrored her own timidity, stirred uneasily beneath her skin. "Run," it whispered. Zella froze, her eyes scanning the dense thicket of ferns and ancient trunks. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding thin and pathetic against the towering trees. A low, vibrating growl was her only answer. It didn't come from one direction. It came from everywhere. From the shadows of the undergrowth they emerged. First one, then 3, then 5. Rogue wolves. They were unkempt, their fur matted with mud and dried blood, their eyes yellow and wild with the madness that came from living without a pack anchor. But these weren't the starving scavengers stories warned about. They moved with synchronized precision, flanking her, cutting off her path to the river and the route back to the village. Zella took a stumbling step back, her heel catching on a root. She didn't shift. Her wolf was too weak, too suppressed by years of malnutrition and neglect to stand a chance against 5 full-grown males. "Well, look at this," the largest rogue sneered, stepping forward in his human form. He was a towering man with a scar bisecting his lip, wearing tattered fatigues. A little stray wandered too far from the kennel. "This is Fenrir's territory," Zella said, trying to inject steel into her voice but failing miserably. "If you touch me, the patrols will hear." The rogue laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "The patrols are guarding the North Ridge. We know the schedules, little stray. No one is coming for a nobody like you." The truth of his words hit her harder than a fist. He was right. She was the invisible girl. If she vanished today, it would be days before anyone noticed, and even then, it would only be because the chores weren't done. "Grab her," the leader commanded, his eyes flashing to his wolf's amber. "We need leverage, and she'll do until we find something better." 2 of the wolves lunged. Zella threw her journal at the first one, a useless gesture of defiance, and turned to run. She didn't make it 3 steps. A heavy weight slammed into her back, driving her face first into the damp earth. The air left her lungs in a wheezing gasp. Claws dug into her shoulders, pinning her down. She screamed, a raw, tearing sound, but a rough hand clamped over her mouth, silencing her. As the weight of the rogues pressed her into the dirt, Zella closed her eyes, tears leaking out to mix with the soil. She prayed for it to be quick. She prayed that if she had to die, she would at least fade away completely, leaving no memory of the girl who wasn't enough. The leader of the rogues grabbed a handful of Zella's hair, yanking her head back to bare her throat. "Quiet now," he hissed, pulling a serrated knife from his belt. "Don't make this messy." But before the blade could touch her skin, the forest exploded. It wasn't a sound, it was a shockwave. A roar so deep and guttural it shook the leaves from the trees reverberated through the clearing, freezing the blood of every living thing in a 100-yard radius. The rogue holding Zella stiffened, his head snapping up, terror instantly replacing his arrogance. From the darkness of the tree line, a shadow detached itself. It was massive. A wolf the size of a warhorse, with fur as black as a starless void, and eyes that burned with the color of molten gold. Fenrir. He didn't pause to posture. He didn't howl a warning. He was a blur of kinetic violence. He cleared the distance in a single bound, his jaws clamping around the throat of the rogue standing nearest to Zella. There was a sickening wet crunch, and the rogue was thrown 20 feet into a tree trunk, his body landing with the limp finality of a rag doll. The rogue holding Zella scrambled back, dropping the knife. "It's the king! Scatter!" he screamed, shifting mid-stride into a patchy brown wolf. "But you do not run from the Alpha King in his own domain." Fenrir moved with a terrifying fluidity. He swatted the brown wolf mid-air, his claws tearing through flank and muscle, sending the creature spinning into the dirt. The other 3 rogues, realizing flight was impossible, turned to fight out of desperation. It was a massacre. Zella pushed herself up on trembling arms, watching through a haze of shock. She had seen alphas fight in ceremonial spars, but she had never seen this. This wasn't fighting. It was an execution. Fenrir was a force of nature. He dodged a snapping jaw with a weave of his massive head, countering with a bite that shattered bone. He moved like water and hit like a falling mountain. Within seconds, the clearing was silent, save for the heavy, wet breathing of the black beast standing amidst the carnage. The smell of iron was thick in the air, choking out the scent of the damp earth. Fenrir stood over the body of the leader, ensuring the threat was ended, before he slowly turned his massive head toward Zella. She couldn't move. She was frozen, kneeling in the mud, staring up at the predator who ruled their world. His golden eyes locked onto hers, and for a heartbeat, she thought she was next. He looked wild, consumed by the kill, his muzzle stained with the consequences of his protection. But then, his ears flicked forward. He lowered his head, taking a step toward her, not with the aggression of an attack, but with a hesitant, investigative grace. He made a low sound in his throat, a rumble that sounded suspiciously like a question. Zella's breath hitched as the monster who haunted the nightmares of their enemies slowly closed the distance, looking at her as if she were the only fragile thing left in the world. The massive black wolf loomed over her, blocking out the gray light of the sky. Zella stopped breathing, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She expected him to turn away, to dismiss her now that the threat was neutralized, or perhaps to bark an order for her to run back to the village. Instead, the air around him shimmered, a heat haze distortion that signaled the shift. Bones cracked and reformed, fur receded into skin, and within moments, the terrifying beast was gone. In his place stood Fenrir, the man. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, sweat and grime streaking his bare torso. He wore only shredded tactical pants, leftovers from the shift, but Zella couldn't look away from his face. His eyes were still glowing with the remnants of his wolf, burning with an intensity that pinned her to the spot. He dropped to one knee in front of her, ignoring the mud soaking into his pants. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice a rough baritone that vibrated through the soles of her feet. Zella couldn't find her voice. She just shook her head, a jerky, mechanical motion. She was scraped, bruised, and terrified, but she wasn't bleeding. Fenrir reached out, his hand hovering for a split second before his large, warm palm cupped her cheek. The moment skin touched skin, the world tilted on its axis. It wasn't a spark. It was a lightning strike. A jolt of pure, undistilled energy surged from the point of contact, racing down Zella's spine and exploding in her chest. It was a feeling of coming home, of a lock clicking into place after a lifetime of fumbling with the wrong keys. Her wolf, which had been cowering moments ago, suddenly threw back its head and howled in silent, joyous recognition. "Mate," Zella gasped, her eyes widening as she looked at him. Fenrir froze, his pupils dilated, swallowing the gold irises until his eyes were almost black. His hand trembled slightly against her skin, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone with a reverence that scared her more than the rogues had. He felt it too. She could see the shock rippling through him, the sudden, crushing realization that the universe had tied him to the girl in the mud. He pulled his hand back as if burned. But he didn't retreat. He leaned in closer, inhaling deeply, his nostrils flaring as he took in her scent, fear, rain, and the underlying sweetness that belonged only to him. "Who are you?" Fenrir whispered, the question laced with genuine bewilderment. The question cut through the haze of the bond. He didn't know her. Of course he didn't. He was the king, and she was the invisible girl. The joy of the bond was instantly doused by the cold bucket of reality. She was Zella, the rejected. Zella, the weak. Zella, who Hati had thrown away like garbage. "I'm nobody," Zella stammered, pulling away from his touch, overwhelmed by the intensity of his gaze. "I'm just Zella." "Zella," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue, tasting it. He looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the frayed cuffs of her jacket, the hollows of her cheeks, the way she flinched when he moved too fast. A dark storm gathered behind his eyes, a mixture of fury and heartache. He realized in that second that his mate, the woman destiny had chosen for the Alpha King, had been living in his kingdom as a ghost, starving for recognition he had failed to give. The urge to claim her was a physical ache. Fenrir's wolf was screaming at him to bite her, to mark her neck, to wrap her in his scent and carry her back to the Alpha estate where no one could ever look at her wrong again. He wanted to parade her in front of the pack and dare anyone to disrespect her. But then he looked at her eyes. They were wide pools of trauma. She was shaking, not just from the cold or the adrenaline, but from a deep-seated belief that she was in trouble. She looked at him not as a partner, but as an authority figure she needed to appease. She had just been attacked by rogues, rejected by her lover, and lived a life of neglect. If he claimed her now, if he thrust the title of Alpha Queen upon her while she was this fragile, it wouldn't be a gift. It would be a burden that crushed her. The pack was a pit of vipers. They would see her weakness and tear her apart before she learned how to stand. He couldn't break her. He had to build her. Fenrir clenched his jaw, forcing his wolf into submission. He stood up, extending a hand to her. "Can you walk?" Zella stared at his hand for a long moment before reaching up. He pulled her to her feet effortlessly, his grip firm but gentle. She swayed, her knees buckling, and without a word, Fenrir scooped her up into his arms. "Put me down," Zella protested weakly, pushing against his hard chest. "I'm heavy. The mud." "Be quiet, Zella," he said, not unkindly. He held her close, allowing himself the small luxury of pressing her head against his shoulder. She smelled of the woods and her own unique scent, something soft like vanilla and steel. He didn't take the main path back to the pack house. He couldn't take her there. If he brought her home looking like this, rumors would fly, and Hati would come sniffing around. He needed somewhere safe, somewhere she could be put back together. He carried her toward the eastern ridge, where the warrior barracks stood, specifically to the small, isolated cabin at the edge of the training grounds. When he kicked the door open, Astra was sitting at a wooden table, cleaning a semi-automatic rifle. She jumped up, her weapon raised, but lowered it instantly when she saw the Alpha. Her eyes widened as they landed on the bundle in his arms. "Fenrir?" Astra asked, her gaze darting from his bloodied chest to the unconscious girl. Zella had passed out somewhere along the walk, exhaustion finally claiming her. "What happened? Who is that?" Fenrir walked to the small cot in the corner and lowered Zella onto it with the care of a man handling a holy relic. He pulled a blanket over her, tucking it around her shoulders, his hand lingering on her hair for a second longer than necessary. He turned to Astra, his expression hard, masking the turmoil raging inside him. "Her name is Zella. Rogues cornered her near the river." "Is she?" Astra trailed off, sensing the thick tension in the room, the way Fenrir's scent was wrapped around the girl. "She is under my protection," Fenrir said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He looked back at the sleeping girl, his heart aching with the distance he was about to put between them. "Train her, Astra. Make her strong. Make her lethal." "Fenrir, wait!" Astra called as he turned to the door. "Why her?" Fenrir paused in the doorway, the evening light casting him in silhouette. He didn't look back, terrified that if he did, he wouldn't be able to leave. Because, he said, his voice rough with unspoken emotion, I need her to be ready for what comes next. He stepped out into the night, leaving his heart in the cabin, knowing that the hardest battle of his life wasn't fighting rogues. It was waiting for his queen to realize she wore a crown. Chapter 3. The first week under Astra's tutelage wasn't training. It was a systematic dismantling of everything Zella thought she knew about her own limits. Astra didn't believe in coddling. She believed that pain was the most honest teacher a wolf could have, and she ensured Zella attended every single lesson. Dawn broke over the eastern ridge, casting long, pale shadows across the muddy sparring pit behind the isolated cabin. Zella lay face down in the dirt, her lungs burning as if she had swallowed hot coals. Every muscle fiber in her body screamed in protest, a chorus of agony that begged her to stay down. Get up! Astra's voice cracked through the morning silence like a whip. She stood 5 feet away, looking annoyingly fresh in her combat gear, her arms crossed over her chest. Rogues don't wait for you to catch your breath. The world doesn't pause because your legs hurt. Up! Zella grit her teeth, tasting iron and grit. She placed her hands on the ground, her arms trembling violently as she pushed herself up. Her body felt heavy, leaden, but the memory of Hati's back as he walked away in the parking lot served as a harsh fuel. You're nothing, the voice in her head whispered, a voice that sounded suspiciously like her Aunt Mara. You're weak. I'm up, Zella wheezed, swaying as she found her footing. Good, Astra said, dropping into a defensive crouch. Again. Astra moved with a terrifying speed. She swept Zella's legs out from under her before Zella could even raise her guard. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but this time, Zella didn't wait for the command. She rolled, scrambling to her feet, and threw a clumsy punch that Astra easily deflected. Stop fighting like a human, Astra barked, stepping into Zella's space and shoving her back. You are a wolf. Use your center of gravity. Use your instincts. You're thinking too much about where your hands go. Stop thinking. Feel. Weeks bled into a month. The bruises on Zella's skin faded into calluses. The softness that had defined her life as an invisible orphan began to harden into something leaner, sharper. She ran until her vision blurred. She lifted weights until her arms felt like they would detach. And through it all, Astra watched with a critical, unyielding eye. One afternoon, under the relentless glare of the midday sun, something shifted. Astra threw a punch aimed at Zella's ribs, a move that had landed a dozen times before. But this time, Zella didn't flinch or retreat. She stepped into the strike, twisting her body to let the fist graze past her, and used the momentum to slam her shoulder into Astra's chest. It wasn't a knockout blow. Astra barely stumbled, but the shock on the warrior's face was worth more than gold. Astra stepped back, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek, and for the first time in weeks, the corner of her mouth ticked up. Not bad, Stray, she muttered. You might actually survive the winter. Zella stood tall, her chest heaving, sweat dripping down her nose. She looked down at her hands. They were scarred, rough, and stained with earth. They weren't the hands of the girl who wrote sad poetry by the river anymore. They were the hands of someone who could hold her own. She wasn't a master, not even close. But the fear that had been her constant companion for years was quieter now. It had been replaced by a simmering, quiet rage, a determination to never be the prey again. She looked toward the main pack house in the distance, a spark lighting in her eyes. She wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. She was sharpening her claws. The sleek black SUV crunched over the gravel drive of the Alpha estate, kicking up dust as it came to a halt. The driver, A young beta hurried to open the back door, but Hati was already stepping out, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive jacket. He took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of the territory. He had been gone for nearly 6 weeks on a diplomatic mission to a neighboring territory, a task his father had insisted upon to bolster his resume for the upcoming beta selection. Hati felt good. The negotiations had gone well, or at least well enough that he wouldn't be embarrassed in front of the council. He walked toward the main grounds with a swagger in his step. He was the brother of the Alpha King, after all. That name carried weight, a gravity that pulled respect from the lower-ranked wolves he passed. He scanned the area, expecting to see the usual routine. Pups playing, elders gossiping, warriors patrolling. But his gaze snagged on the distant training fields. Usually that area was reserved for the elite guard, the top-tier fighters who reported directly to Fenrir. But today, there was a crowd gathered near the sparring rings, watching something with rapt attention. Curiosity piqued, Hati veered off the path. As he got closer, he recognized Astra's distinctive fighting style in the ring. She was sparring with someone, a female who moved with a surprising, scrappy agility. The challenger was losing, clearly, but she was tenacious, bouncing back from hits that would have floored most regular pack members. Hati frowned, squinting against the sun. The girl's hair was tied back in a severe braid, revealing the sharp line of her jaw and the sweat glistening on her neck. She wore a tight tactical tank top that showed off defined muscles in her arms and back, muscles that hadn't been there before. The girl ducked a swing and landed a solid kick to Astra's shin before being tackled into the dirt. The crowd cheered, impressed by the grit. Astra helped the girl up, clapping her on the back. The girl turned, wiping her face with her forearm, and smiled. A fierce, breathless expression that transformed her face. Hati stopped dead in his tracks, his briefcase nearly slipping from his fingers. It was Zella, but it wasn't his Zella. The girl he had left in the parking lot had been soft, rounded with baby fat, eyes perpetually downcast and filled with adoration for him. This woman was wire-taut tension and steel. She stood with her feet apart, grounding herself, her chin lifted in a way he had never seen. She looked incredible. A confusing mix of emotions churned in Hati's gut. Disbelief, first, followed quickly by a hot surge of possessiveness. He had discarded her because she was weak, because she didn't fit the image of a leader's mate. But looking at her now, standing in the ring with the Alpha's best warrior, she looked every inch the prize he had claimed he wanted. And then, he saw him. Standing on the edge of the field, leaning against a support beam with his arms crossed, was Fenrir. The Alpha King wasn't watching the crowd. He wasn't watching Astra. His golden gaze was locked entirely, intensely, on Zella. There was a hunger in his brother's stillness, a predatory focus that made the hair on the back of Hati's neck stand up. Hati's jaw clenched. He didn't know what game Zella was playing, trying to reinvent herself while he was gone, but the way Fenrir was looking at her made Hati's blood boil. She was his ex, his cast-off, and nobody, not even the king, looked at Hati's property with that kind of heat without consequences. He adjusted his jacket, his face hardening into a mask of arrogant resolve, and began to march toward the ring. The training session ended, and the crowd began to disperse. Zella grabbed her water bottle, her hands shaking slightly from the exertion. It was a good shake, the kind that meant she had emptied the tank. She felt Astra's approving nod before the warrior moved off to rack the weapons, leaving Zella alone near the edge of the field to cool down. She closed her eyes, tilting her head back to let the breeze cool her flushed skin. For a moment she felt peaceful. "So, this is what you've been doing?" The voice was familiar enough to make her stomach drop. But the reaction wasn't the crushing heartbreak she expected. It was annoyance. Zella opened her eyes and lowered her head to find Hati standing a few feet away. He looked polished and out of place in his pristine clothes amidst the dust and sweat of the training ground. "Hati," she said, her voice flat. She didn't shrink away. She didn't wrap her arms around herself. She just stood there, watching him. Hati looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on the bare skin of her arms, the way her chest rose and fell. A smirk played on his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I have to admit, Zella, I'm impressed. I didn't think you had it in you. Trying to toughen up to prove me wrong?" "I'm not doing this for you," Zella said, taking a sip of water and screwing the cap back on with deliberate slowness. "I'm doing this so I don't die." Hati stepped closer, invading her personal space. The old Zella would have stepped back. The new Zella held her ground. "Come on, Z. We both know why you're here. You're trying to get my attention. Well, it worked. You look good, stronger. Maybe I was too hasty." The audacity of it stole the breath from her lungs. He spoke as if he were shopping for a car, reconsidering a model he had previously passed over. "Too hasty?" she repeated, a dark laugh bubbling up in her throat. "You left me in a parking lot, Hati. You told me I wasn't enough." "I was under pressure," Hati said smoothly, reaching out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His touch, once something she craved, now felt slimy. "My father, the council, they want me to secure the beta position. But seeing you now, maybe we could work something out. You could be on the side. We still have chemistry, don't we?" Zella slapped his hand away. The sound was sharp, silencing the nearby chatter. Hati recoiled, his face twisting in shock and anger. "Don't touch me," Zella hissed, stepping into him, her eyes blazing. "You threw me away, Hati. You looked at me and decided I was trash because I didn't have a title. You don't get to pick me up again just because I look shiny now. I am not a toy you can put on a shelf and play with when you're bored. You should be careful." Hati lowered his voice, his ego bruised and dangerous. "You're still a nobody, Zella. Training with Astra doesn't change your blood. You belong to me because no one else would want a stray like you. She belongs to herself." The voice came from behind Hati, deep and resonant like the rumble of an approaching earthquake. Hati froze, the color draining from his face. Zella looked past Hati's shoulder to see Fenrir standing there. He hadn't shouted, but the sheer weight of his presence sucked the oxygen out of the air. The Alpha King wasn't posturing. He was existing, and that was terrifying enough. Hati turned slowly, fixing a strained smile on his face as he faced his older brother. "Fenrir, I was just catching up with an old friend. No need to get involved in a domestic dispute." Fenrir didn't smile. He didn't blink. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, but the tension in his shoulders suggested violence was a very near possibility. He moved past Hati as if he were an obstacle of no consequence, and stopped beside Zella. He didn't touch her, but he placed himself distinctly between her and Hati, a living wall of muscle and authority. "It didn't look like catching up," Fenrir said, his voice eerily calm. "It looked like harassment." "She's my ex," Hati argued, his jealousy flaring up despite his fear. He looked between Fenrir and Zella, connecting the dots he had tried to ignore earlier. "Wait a minute. Is this why she's here? Are you keeping her?" "Watch your tone, brother," Fenrir warned, the growl finally slipping into his voice. Hati laughed, a bitter, incredulous sound. "This is rich. The Alpha King picking up my scraps? She's nothing, Fenrir. She's a weak-blooded orphan. Dad would roll over in his grave if he saw you protecting her." The air temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Fenrir took a single step toward Hati. It was a small movement, but Hati stumbled back 3 paces, his survival instincts screaming at him to submit. Fenrir's eyes flashed gold, the wolf coming to the surface, struggling against the leash of his humanity. "You judge her by her blood," Fenrir said softly, leaning down so only Hati could hear the promise of destruction in his words. "I judge her by her spirit, and her spirit is stronger than yours ever will be." Fenrir straightened, casting a shadow over his brother. "Let me make the rules of this new game very clear to you, Hati. You made your choice. You walked away. That door is closed, and I welded it shut." He glanced at Zella, checking her for injuries with a brief, intense sweep of his eyes, before turning his cold gaze back to Hati. "Touch her again," Fenrir whispered, the threat hanging heavy and absolute in the silence of the training ground. "And being my brother won't save you." Hati stared at him, mouth slightly open, realizing for the first time that he wasn't just fighting for a girl. He was standing on the precipice of a war he couldn't win. He looked at Zella, seeing the way she stood slightly behind Fenrir, protected, chosen, and hatred curled in his gut like a viper. He nodded once, stiffly, and turned to storm away, humiliated and burning with a need for retribution. Fenrir didn't watch him go. He turned to Zella. "Are you all right?" Zella looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had never seen anyone stand up to Hati like that. She had never felt protected. "I handled it," she said, though her voice was breathless. "I know," Fenrir said, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "But you don't have to handle everything alone anymore." From the balcony of the Alpha estate overlooking the fields, a figure watched the scene unfold. Ylfa gripped the stone railing, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the rock. She had seen the body language. She had seen the Alpha King step between the orphan and his own brother. She saw the way he looked at her, like she was precious. A cold, calculating smile spread across Ylfa's face. It wasn't just a fling, it was a threat, and threats needed to be neutralized before they could take root. Chapter 4. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in bruises of purple and charcoal, but Ylfa did not move from her vantage point on the Alpha Estate's stone terrace. Her grip on the railing was white-knuckled, her nails chipping against the unforgiving masonry. Below, the training ground was emptying, the spectacle over, but the image of what had transpired was burned into her retinas like the afterimage of a flashbang. She had watched Hati, a high-ranking male of noble birth, retreat with his tail effectively tucked between his legs. She had watched Fenrir, the Alpha King, a man whose favor she had cultivated for years with surgical precision, step in to defend a nobody. It wasn't the defense itself that made bile rise in Ylfa's throat. Alphas were wired to protect the weak. It was the way he stood. He hadn't stood in front of Zella like a shield. He had stood with her like a partner. Ylfa watched as Fenrir said something low to the girl, his head inclined toward hers in a gesture of intimacy that screamed of a bond far deeper than casual interest. Zella looked up at him, her face dirty and bruised, lacking any of the refinement or poise required of a high-ranking female. And yet Fenrir looked at her as if she held the secrets of the universe in her grime-streaked hands. "Unacceptable," Ylfa whispered, the word hissing through her teeth. She turned away from the railing, her silk robe rustling like dry leaves. She paced the length of the terrace, her mind racing. She had played the game perfectly. She was the daughter of Elder Rudna. She was educated, lethal in a fight, and politically astute. She had waited patiently for Fenrir to finish his mourning period for his late father, positioning herself as the inevitable choice for his queen. It was simple math. Strength plus status equals stability. but Zella was a chaotic variable. Ilfa stopped pacing, her reflection catching in the glass doors of the balcony. She saw a woman of breeding and power. Then she thought of Zella, the orphan who wore hand-me-downs and smelled of the kitchens. If Fenrir chose her, it wouldn't just be a personal insult to Ilfa. It would be a dismantling of the social order. A weak queen meant a weak pack. It meant that blood didn't matter. And if blood didn't matter, then Ilfa's entire existence, her entire superiority, was a lie. She couldn't let that happen. Hati was a fool who tried to use brute force and failed, but Ilfa was different. She understood that to kill a weed, you didn't hack at the leaves, you poisoned the roots. She smoothed her hair, her expression shifting from rage to a mask of cool, concerned diplomacy. Fenrir was compromised by lust or some misguided instinct, but the council listened to reason and fear. The council chamber was a mausoleum of tradition, smelling of old parchment and burning cedar. The walls were lined with tapestries depicting the great victories of the pack, a visual reminder of the history that weighed on every decision made within these stone walls. Elder Rudina and Elder Randell sat at the heavy oak table, reviewing the grain requisitions for the coming winter. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, and Ilfa entered. She walked with a measured grace, her head bowed slightly in a show of respect that she knew the elders craved. "Father, Elder Randell," Ilfa said softly, stopping at the edge of the table. "I apologize for the intrusion, but there is a matter of some urgency regarding the pack's stability." Rudina looked up, his eyebrows knitting together. He was a stern man with graying temples and a rigid belief in the old ways. "Ilfa, we are busy with the winter stocks. Can this not wait?" "I wish it could," Ilfa said, stepping closer, her voice laced with a carefully curated anxiety. "But I just came from the training grounds. I witnessed an incident between Hati and the Alpha." Randell, a sharp-eyed woman who managed the pack's internal affairs, leaned forward. "An incident? A fight?" "Nearly," Ilfa lied smoothly. Hati was attempting to correct a lower-ranking wolf, the orphan Zella, for disrespecting the hierarchy. But Fenrir intervened. He threatened his own brother, his own blood, to protect her. Rudina scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Fenrir is protective. He has a soft spot for the strays. It is a weakness, but hardly a crisis." "It is when that soft spot blinds him to duty," Ilfa countered, her voice hardening just enough to show conviction. "He wasn't just protecting a stray, father. He was looking at her as if she were his equal. There are rumors, whispers that he intends to elevate her." The silence that followed was absolute. In their world, elevating a low-born wolf to a position of power was akin to inviting a disease into the stronghold. It diluted the magical strength of the pack leaders. "That is impossible," Randell said, though her voice lacked certainty. "Zella comes from a line of weaklings. Her parents died in a minor skirmish because they couldn't hold their shift. If Fenrir mates with her, their offspring would be vulnerable. The alpha line would degrade." "Exactly," Ilfa said, pressing her advantage. "Fenrir is young. He is being led by his instincts, by a fleeting infatuation with a girl who has manipulated her way into his vision by playing the victim. If he claims her, the neighboring packs will see it as a loss of strength. They will attack. We could lose everything." She rested her hands on the table, looking between the two elders with pleading eyes. "I only want what is best for the pack. We cannot allow a mistake of the heart to destroy centuries of breeding." Rudina sighed, rubbing his temples. The seed of doubt had been planted, and Ilfa watched with satisfaction as it took root. "We will speak to him," Rudina said finally. "We will remind him of his duties. Tradition exists for a reason." Ilfa nodded, bowing her head again to hide the triumph in her eyes. "Thank you, Father." She turned and left the chamber, the heavy doors closing behind her with a solid thud. But as she walked down the stone corridor, her smile faded. The elders would talk, yes. They would lecture Fenrir. But Fenrir was the Alpha King. He could overrule them. Talk wasn't enough. Words were wind. Ilfa needed an anchor. She needed to ensure that even if Fenrir wanted to choose the orphan, there would be no orphan left to choose. The village market was winding down for the evening, the stalls closing up as the twilight deepened. Zella walked along the cobblestone path, her body aching from training but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, she walked with her head up. She wasn't watching her feet. She was watching the world. And the world seemed a little less gray. She turned the corner toward the path that led to the housing units, but her way was blocked. Ilfa stood in the center of the narrow alley, flanked by the stone walls of the bakery and the tanner's shop. She looked immaculate in a coat of cream wool, not a hair out of place, a stark contrast to Zella's sweat-stained tactical gear. Zella stopped, her instincts flaring. "Ilfa," she acknowledged, keeping her voice steady. "Zella," Ilfa replied, her tone conversational, as if they were meeting for tea. She stepped forward, looking Zella up and down with a gaze that felt like it was peeling back layers of skin. "I saw you today. Quite the show. I didn't know you had it in you to cause such a scene." "I didn't cause anything," Zella said, stepping to the side to go around her. "I was just training." Ilfa mirrored the movement, blocking her again. "Training," she laughed softly. "Is that what you call it? I call it auditioning. Do you really think that if you learn to throw a punch, the pack will forget what you are?" Zella stiffened. "I know what I am." "Do you?" Ilfa moved closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've deluded yourself. You think because the Alpha looked at you twice, you matter. But you're just a novelty, Zella, a charity case. Fenrir picks up strays because it makes him feel benevolent. But kings don't marry strays. They keep them in kennels." The words were sharp, designed to cut specifically at the insecurities Zella had nursed her entire life. Charity case. Kennel. It echoed what Hati had said, what her aunts implied with their silence. "I'm not a stray," Zella said, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "I'm a member of this pack." "Barely," Ilfa sneered, dropping the mask of politeness entirely. "Your blood is thin water compared to the wine of the elite. You are forbidden fruit, Zella. Not because you are special, but because you are poisonous. You will weaken him. You will weaken us. If you truly cared about this pack, you would disappear." Zella looked into Ilfa's eyes and saw something terrifying. It wasn't just snobbery, it was hatred. Pure, unadulterated hatred, born of fear. And suddenly, Zella realized something Astra had told her. They only attack you if you're a threat. "I'm not going anywhere," Zella said, stepping forward, forcing Ilfa to give ground or collide. "And if Fenrir thinks I'm weak, let him tell me himself. I don't need a messenger." She brushed past Ilfa, her shoulder checking the high-born wolf hard enough to make Ilfa stumble. Zella didn't look back, walking away with a rapid heart but a straight spine. Behind her, Ilfa stood frozen, staring at Zella's retreating back. The audacity, the absolute insolence. Ilfa's hands shook with rage. The elders were too slow. Protocol was too gentle. Zella wasn't just a nuisance, she was a cancer. And cancers had to be cut out before they killed the host. Night had fully fallen by the time Ilfa reached the healing center on the western edge of the village. The windows were dark. The healers had gone home for the night, leaving the infirmary unmanned save for the occasional patrol check. Ilfa slipped through the back door, using a key she had copied from her father's ring months ago. The air inside was cool and smelled of antiseptic and dried herbs. She moved quickly, knowing exactly where to go. She didn't want poisons that would leave a trace. Arsenic or cyanide were too obvious, too clumsy. She needed something that would incapacitate, something that would make a wolf sluggish, confused, unable to shift or run. She opened the locked cabinet at the rear of the room, her fingers dancing over the glass vials. Morphine? No. Wolfsbane. Too detectable by scent. Her hand landed on a small, unmarked blue bottle. Somnus extract. It was a concentrated sedative used for surgeries on shifted wolves. It was odorless, tasteless, and fast-acting. She plucked the bottle from the shelf, sliding it into her pocket. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A thrilling mix of fear and power. This was it. She was crossing a line from which there was no return. If she was caught, the punishment would be severe. But she wouldn't be caught. She was Ilfa, the clever one, the rightful queen. She closed the cabinet and locked it, wiping the handle with her sleeve to remove any prints. As she stepped back out into the cool night air, a plan formed in her mind, crystalline and cruel. Zella loved the forest. She loved that pathetic little spot by the river. It was poetic, really. The very place where the orphan went to hide from the world would become the place where she left it permanently. Ilfa touched the bottle in her pocket like a talisman. Tomorrow she would send a message. Tomorrow there would be an accident. A tragic fire in the deep woods caused by the dry season and a careless camper. And when the ashes cooled, the Alpha's distraction would be gone, and the natural order would be restored. She walked back toward the estate, her steps light, the moon casting a long, twisted shadow that stretched out before her like a premonition of the darkness to come. Chapter 5. The note had been tucked inside her locker in the warrior's barracks, a simple scrap of parchment folded into a sharp square. River. Sunset. We need to talk about Hati. Zella's heart had done a traitorous double beat. Fenrir. It was succinct, commanding, and direct. Exactly like him. She hadn't questioned it. Why would she? The Alpha King didn't make social calls, and if he wanted to discuss his brother, the privacy of the deep woods made sense. She jogged along the overgrown path, the evening light filtering through the canopy in dappled patterns of gray and dying gold. The forest was quiet, the wind rustling the dry leaves that littered the floor, signaling the drought that had plagued the territory for weeks. She reached the clearing by the river, her chest heaving slightly from the run. The water churned against the rocks, the only sound in the unsettling stillness. "Fenrir," she called out, scanning the tree line. There was no sign of the massive black wolf or the imposing man. Instead, a figure stepped out from behind the trunk of a twisted oak. It wasn't the king. "He's not coming," Ilfa said, her voice smooth as polished glass. She wore dark tactical gear, a stark departure from her usual silks, and held a small, sleek pistol-grip syringe in her gloved hand. Zella stepped back, her instincts flaring. "You wrote the note." "I did," Ilfa admitted, walking forward with a casual, predatory grace. "I needed to get you away from the barracks. Too many eyes there. Too many witnesses." "What do you want, Ilfa?" Zella demanded, dropping into the defensive stance Astra had drilled into her. "If you want to fight, let's fight, but I'm done listening to your speeches." Ilfa stopped 10 feet away, a pitying smile curling her lips. "Oh, Zella, I don't want to fight you. Fighting implies you have a chance." She gestured vaguely to the woods around them. "I'm just doing what the gardeners do. I'm weeding the plot so the prize roses can grow." "You're insane," Zella muttered, her eyes tracking the syringe. "I'm devoted," Ilfa corrected. "To the bloodline. To the pack. You are a genetic dead end, Zella. And Fenrir, he's confused. He thinks he wants a pet, but he needs a queen. I'm just correcting his vision." Zella tensed, preparing to shift or run, but she was too slow. A faint thwip sound cut through the air. She felt a sharp pinch in her neck, like a mosquito bite but deeper. She slapped a hand to the spot, pulling out a small red-feathered dart. Ilfa hadn't moved. The syringe in her hand was a decoy. The blowgun had been concealed in her sleeve. "Somnus extract," Ilfa explained as Zella's vision blurred. "Fast acting. You won't die from it, of course. That would be murder." The ground tilted violently. Zella's legs turned to rubber, and she crumpled to her knees, the strength draining from her muscles as if someone had pulled a plug. She tried to scream, to shift, to do anything, but her tongue felt like it was made of lead. She slumped sideways into the dirt, her eyes wide and terrified, locked on Ilfa's boots. "No," Ilfa continued, crouching down to stroke Zella's hair. "The fire will take care of the rest. A tragic accident, a camper's negligence, and you, the poor, weak orphan, just couldn't run fast enough." Ilfa moved with efficient, terrifying calm. She pulled a canister from her pack, unscrewing the cap. The smell of accelerant was acrid and chemical, cutting through the natural scents of the forest. She splashed the liquid in a wide circle around Zella, coating the dry leaves, the moss, and the base of the surrounding trees. Zella watched, trapped inside her own body. Her mind was screaming, a frantic cacophony of panic, but her limbs refused to obey. She was a statue made of flesh, forced to witness her own execution. "Move," she commanded her legs. "Move, damn you." A single finger twitched, but that was all. "Goodbye, Zella," Ilfa said softly. She struck a match against the sole of her boot. The flame flared to life, a tiny dancing orange light against the encroaching darkness. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed it onto the fuel-soaked ground. The world exploded. There was no slow build-up. The accelerant caught with a whoosh, and a wall of heat slammed into Zella's face. The flames leaped 10 feet high in seconds, hungry and roaring, devouring the dry underbrush with terrifying speed. Ilfa didn't look back. She turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving Zella alone in the center of the ring of fire. The heat was unbearable. It seared her skin, drying the moisture in her eyes instantly. Smoke began to curl inward, black and choking, filling her lungs with every shallow breath she managed to take. Zella coughed weakly, her body convulsing, but the paralysis held her firm. "Is this it?" she thought, watching the fire crawl closer to her boots. After everything? After the rejection, the training, the hope. Her wolf whimpered in the back of her mind, scratching at the mental walls, desperate to break free. The survival instinct was primal, ancient, and it began to war with the sedative. Zella focused on the pain. The heat blistering her skin was agonizing, but it was also grounding. She used it. She grabbed onto the pain and pulled, forcing her will against the chemical fog clouding her brain. She managed to drag her arm a few inches, then her leg. It wasn't enough. The fire was roaring now, the sound like a freight train, drowning out the river. A burning branch snapped and fell, landing inches from her head, sending a shower of sparks into her hair. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears evaporating before they could fall, and screamed a silent name into the void. Fenrir. 3 miles away, in the war room of the Alpha estate, Fenrir stopped mid-sentence. He was in the middle of briefing Astra on the new border rotations, pointing at a map spread across the table. But suddenly the map didn't matter. The room didn't matter. A sharp, icy spike of terror drove itself into his chest, stopping his heart for a full beat. It wasn't his fear. It was hers. "Fenrir?" Astra asked, lowering her clipboard. "What is it?" Fenrir's head snapped up, his nostrils flaring. Through the open window, beneath the scent of damp earth and cooling stone, came a faint, distinct smell. Wood smoke. But not the cozy smell of a hearth. This was the smell of destruction. "Zella," Fenrir rasped, the name tearing out of his throat. "What?" Astra moved to the window, sniffing the air. "I smell smoke, but—" "She's out there," Fenrir growled, his eyes flashing gold. The Bond was screaming at him now, a frantic distress signal that blurred his vision. He didn't wait for Astra. He didn't bother with the stairs. He vaulted over the balcony railing, shifting mid-air. The transformation was violent and instant. He hit the ground as the massive black wolf, his claws tearing up the manicured lawn as he launched himself toward the tree line. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life. The forest blurred into streaks of green and brown. The scent of smoke grew stronger, heavier, transforming from a nuisance into a suffocating blanket. Animals were fleeing in the opposite direction. Deer, rabbits, foxes, all running for their lives. Fenrir ran against the tide. As he neared the river, the temperature spiked. The orange glow of the fire illuminated the night sky, casting terrifying shadows through the trees. The roar of the blaze was deafening. He burst into the clearing area and skidded to a halt, the heat singeing his fur. The sanctuary was gone. In its place was a hellscape. A ring of fire surrounded the riverbank, the flames licking at the canopy above. And there, in the center of the inferno, lying motionless on the ground, was Zella. Fenrir didn't think. He didn't calculate the risk. He threw his head back and let out a roar of defiance, then charged straight into the wall of fire. The flames bit at his flanks, scorching his skin. But he felt nothing but the need to reach her. He leaped over a burning log, landing beside her prone form. He shifted back instantly, ignoring the searing heat on his bare skin. "Zella!" He grabbed her shoulders, pulling her up. She was limp, her eyes glassy, her skin hot to the touch. "Zella, wake up!" She blinked sluggishly, recognition flickering in her gaze. "Fenrir," she slurred, her head lulling. "I've got you," he choked out, coughing as the smoke swirled around them. He scooped her into his arms, her weight nothing to him, but the fire had other plans. The wind shifted, fanning the flames, sending a tower of fire spiraling up the ancient oak tree above them. The wood groaned, a sound like a dying giant. "We have to move," Fenrir growled. He turned, shielding Zella's body with his own, and sprinted for the gap in the flames near the water. The forest was collapsing. The heat had weakened the structural integrity of the old trees, and the fire was consuming them from the inside out. Fenrir held Zella tight against his chest, his eyes streaming from the smoke, navigating the burning maze. He was 10 feet from the relative safety of the rocky riverbank when the cracking sound echoed above them. Loud, sharp, and final. Fenrir looked up. A massive, burning branch, thick as a torso, was plummeting straight for them. There was no time to dodge, no time to run. "Down!" Fenrir roared. He threw Zella forward, flinging her body away from the impact zone toward the water's edge. In the same second, he tried to dive, but he wasn't fast enough. The burning limb crashed down with the force of a falling building. It struck Fenrir across the lower back and legs, slamming him into the hard earth. The breath was driven from his body in a spray of blood. A sickening crack echoed through the clearing, louder than the fire. Fenrir screamed. a raw, animalistic sound of agony that tore through the roar of the flames. The tree pinned him to the ground, its weight immense, the fire on its bark searing into his skin. Zella, who had landed hard on the rocks, scrambled to her hands and knees. The shock of the fall and the adrenaline spike momentarily pierced through the sedative's fog. She turned, her eyes widening in horror. "Fenrir!" she screamed, her voice raspy from the smoke. She tried to stand, her legs wobbling, and stumbled toward him. He was trapped. The massive limb had him pinned from the waist down. He was clawing at the dirt, trying to drag himself free, but the weight was immovable. "Go!" Fenrir gasped, his face twisted in pain, blood coating his teeth. "Zella, run! The rest of the tree is coming down." She looked up. The trunk of the oak was swaying dangerously, consumed by fire. If it fell, it would crush everything in this radius. "No!" Zella fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over the burning log trapping him. The heat coming off it blistered her palms. "I'm not leaving you," she sobbed, grabbing his arm. "You can't move it," Fenrir wheezed, his eyes starting to roll back from the pain. "It's too heavy. Save yourself. That is an order, Zella. Go." She looked at him, the king who had stood between her and the world, the man who had looked at her breakage and seen a queen. He was dying. He was dying to save her. Something inside Zella snapped. The sedative, the fear, the weakness, it all evaporated in the face of a rage so pure it felt like divine intervention. Her wolf surged forward, merging with her human consciousness in a way she had never experienced. It wasn't a shift. It was a fusion. "No," she growled, her voice dropping an octave, vibrating with power. She stood up, planting her feet in the burning soil. She jammed her hands under the burning log, ignoring the smell of her own searing flesh. She didn't think about her bloodline. She didn't think about physics. She thought about him. She screamed, a primal, tearing shriek, and pulled. Muscles she didn't know she had strained to the breaking point. Veins popped in her neck. Her vision went red. But the log moved. Fenrir watched through a haze of agony, his eyes widening in disbelief. The girl who had been tossed aside by the pack, the girl deemed too weak to breed, was lifting a weight that would have stalled a beta. "Move!" Zella roared at him, her eyes glowing a violent, luminous amber. With a final, earth-shattering heave, she lifted the burning trunk inches off the ground. Fenrir didn't waste the miracle. He clawed his way forward, dragging his crushed legs out from under the trap just as Zella's strength gave out. She dropped the log. It slammed into the earth where Fenrir's spine had been a second ago. Zella collapsed, gasping, her hands burned and shaking. But she didn't stop. She grabbed Fenrir by his tactical vest and hauled him up, draping his arm over her shoulder. She bore his weight, staggering toward the river, dragging the Alpha King away from the hellscape, refusing to let death have him. They hit the water just as the main tree came down behind them, sending a tsunami of sparks and ash into the night sky. Chapter 6. The river was cold, a shocking contrast to the inferno that raged just yards away, but Zella didn't feel the chill. She felt only the dead weight of Fenrir against her side and the frantic, hummingbird beat of her own heart. She dragged him up onto the muddy bank, away from the water's edge, her boots slipping on the wet stones. "Down," Fenrir groaned, his voice a wet rasp. He collapsed onto the silt, his face gray with shock. His legs, which had been pinned under the burning oak, were a mess of torn tactical gear and mangled flesh. Steam rose from his skin where the river water met the burns. Zella dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his injuries, terrified to touch him. "I got you," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a jagged rhythm. "You're okay. I got you." Fenrir squeezed his eyes shut, fighting a wave of agony, before forcing them open to look at her. His golden irises were blown wide, swallowing the pupils. He didn't look at his crushed legs. He looked at her hands. Zella followed his gaze. Her palms were blistered, the skin angry and red where she had gripped the burning log. She hadn't even felt it until now. "Your hands!" Fenrir choked out, reaching up with a trembling arm to grasp her wrist. His touch was gentle, ghosts of his fingers brushing the unburned skin of her forearm. You lifted it." "I had to," Zella said, her voice breaking. Tears finally cut tracks through the soot on her face. "You were going to die. You told me to leave you." "I ordered you to leave," Fenrir corrected, a faint, pained smile touching his lips. "You disobeyed your alpha." "I don't care," she sobbed, leaning over him, her forehead resting against his chest. She could hear his heart, strong and steady despite the trauma, and it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "I'm not Hati. I don't walk away when things get hard." Fenrir let out a breath that shuddered through his entire frame. He moved his hand to the back of her head, tangling his fingers in her singed hair, holding her there against him. The bond between them, which had been a hum before, was now a roar. It wasn't just biology. It was gratitude. It was awe. He had spent his life being the shield for everyone else, the unshakable pillar of the pack. No one had ever saved him. No one had ever looked at a hopeless situation and decided to tear the world apart rather than let him go. "Mate," Fenrir whispered, the word heavy with finality. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a vow. "You are my mate, Zella, my queen." Zella lifted her head, looking into his eyes. The fire reflected in them, but the warmth she saw there had nothing to do with the flames. "I know," she said softly. A howl cut through the night, a sound of pure panic. It was followed by another, and then the thundering of paws. The pack was coming. The rescue party. Fenrir gritted his teeth, trying to sit up, his alpha instincts warring with his injuries. "They're here." "Stay down," Zella ordered, placing a hand on his chest. She turned toward the tree line, her body shifting instinctively to shield him. She wasn't the cowering girl who hid in the shadows anymore. She was the guardian of the king, and God help anyone who tried to hurt him now. The first to break through the smoke was Astra. She was in her wolf form, a sleek silver-gray blur, but she shifted mid-stride as she saw them, skidding to a halt in the mud. She was naked, covered in ash, her eyes wild with terror. Behind her, a dozen warriors poured into the riverbank area, weapons drawn, confusion and fear radiating off them in waves. "Fenrir!" Astra screamed, dropping to her knees beside Zella. Her eyes scanned the alpha's mangled legs, and she blanched. "He need healers. Now, get the stretcher." Two warriors scrambled back toward the trail. Astra turned her frantic gaze to Zella. "What happened? The fire. We thought you were dead." "It wasn't an accident," Zella said, her voice cold and hard as granite. She stood up, her legs trembling but holding her weight. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. "Ilfa did this." Astra froze, looking up at Zella. "Ilfa? That's a heavy accusation, Zella." "She drugged me," Zella stated flatly. She pointed toward the smoking ruins of the clearing. "She used a blowgun, somnus extract. She paralyzed me and set the fire. She wanted me to burn." The warriors nearby exchanged uneasy glances. Accusing the daughter of an elder was dangerous ground. "Check the perimeter," Fenrir growled from the ground. His voice was weak, but the command carried the weight of absolute authority. If Zella says it was Ilfa, then it was Ilfa. Find the proof. Astra nodded, her expression hardening. She turned to the warriors. You heard the alpha. Comb the area. Look for anything that doesn't belong. While the healers swarmed Fenrir, stabilizing his legs and preparing him for transport, Astra moved into the blackened edge of the forest. Zella refused to leave Fenrir's side, gripping his hand as they loaded him onto the stretcher. But her eyes were on the woods, watching Astra. 10 minutes later, Astra emerged from the gloom. She held something in her hand, wrapped in a cloth. Her face was a mask of dark fury. She walked straight to Fenrir and Zella. Found it, Astra said, her voice tight. She opened her hand to reveal a small blue glass vial. The label had been partially burned away, but the medical insignia was clear. It was tossed in the bushes near the trailhead, sloppy. Fenrir looked at the vial, his eyes darkening. Somnus, he hissed. And this, Astra added, pulling a small, charred object from her pocket. It was a metal casing. Part of a lighter, high-end, engraved. She turned it over, revealing a stylized R etched into the silver. The crest of Elder Rudina's family. The silence that fell over the group was suffocating. This wasn't just an attack. It was treason. It was an assassination attempt that had nearly taken out the Alpha. Bring her to me, Fenrir commanded, struggling to sit up on the stretcher despite the healer's protests. Bring Ilfa to the main courtyard. Wake the council. Wake the pack. I want everyone to see this. You need to get to the infirmary, a healer urged. I said, Fenrir snarled, his eyes glowing. Bring her to me. The main courtyard of the pack house was usually a place of celebration, bathed in the warm glow of the fire pit. Tonight, it looked like a tribunal. Floodlights cut through the lingering smoke, casting harsh, long shadows across the stone. The air smelled of wet ash and fear. The entire pack had gathered. Word had spread like the fire itself. The Alpha was hurt, the forest was destroyed, and a traitor had been named. They stood in a wide circle, murmuring, their faces pale. Fenrir sat on a makeshift throne, a heavy wooden chair brought out from the hall. His legs were splinted and bandaged, his face pale and streaked with soot, but he radiated a terrifying, cold power. Zella stood at his right hand. She hadn't cleaned up. She wore her burns and her dirt like armor, her hand resting protectively on the back of Fenrir's chair. On the other side of the circle, Hati stood with the crowd, looking pale and sick. He stared at Zella, at the burns on her hands, realizing with a dawning horror what she had survived. Two warriors dragged Ilfa into the center of the circle. She wasn't in cuffs, but the grip on her arms was unyielding. She looked immaculate, her hair perfect, her clothes smelling of expensive perfume, a jarring contrast to the devastation around her. This is ridiculous, Ilfa shouted, wrenching her arm free. She looked at the crowd, her eyes wide with feigned indignation. I was in my quarters all evening. You drag me out here like a criminal because of the word of a hallucinating stray? We have the vial, Ilfa, Astra said, stepping into the light. She held up the blue bottle and the engraved lighter. And we have this, your father's crest. Elder Rudina, standing near the front, turned a shade of gray that matched the ash. He looked at his daughter, then at the lighter. Horror dawning on his face. Ilfa, is this true? Ilfa's mask didn't slip. It shattered. She looked at the evidence, then at Fenrir, seeing the utter lack of mercy in his eyes. She realized there was no way out. So she did the only thing she could. She doubled down. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin with arrogant pride. Yes, she spat, her voice ringing out clearly. I did it. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Why? Elder Randell asked, stepping forward, her voice trembling. You nearly killed the Alpha. I didn't do it to hurt Fenrir, Ylfa screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Zella. I did it to save him, to save all of you. Look at her. She is a weakness. She is a genetic dead end who bewitched our king. If he mates with her, our pack becomes a laughingstock. We become vulnerable. She turned to the crowd, her eyes wild. I did what had to be done to protect our bloodline. I burned the weeds so the garden could survive. I am the only one here with the courage to do what is necessary. She panted, her chest heaving, waiting for the applause, for the agreement. But there was only silence. Fenrir leaned forward, wincing slightly as his injuries shifted. You talk of weakness, he said, his voice low, carrying effortlessly across the courtyard. You talk of protecting the pack, yet tonight, when the fire you started threatened to consume me, do you know who saved me? He reached up and took Zella's blistered hand, holding it up for everyone to see. It wasn't a high-born wolf, Fenrir continued. It wasn't an elder. It wasn't you, Ylfa. It was Zella. She walked into the fire you set. She lifted the tree that crushed me. She dragged me to safety while her own skin burned. Fenrir's eyes blazed gold. You call her weak? She carried your king when he could not walk. That is not weakness, Ylfa. That is power. Ylfa faltered, the righteous anger draining out of her as she looked around. She didn't see support. She saw disgust. The pack looked at Zella, really looked at her, and they didn't see an orphan anymore. They saw the woman who had saved their leader. Father! Ylfa looked at Elder Rudina, pleading. Rudina turned his face away, his shoulders slumping. He could not save her from this. Fenrir gripped the arms of his chair, using his immense upper body strength to push himself to a standing position. Zella moved to help him, but he waved her off. He needed to stand for this. He swayed, pain etched on his face, but he stood tall. For the crime of treason, Fenrir announced, his voice booming like thunder. For the attempted murder of a pack member, and for endangering the entire territory. I strip you of your rank. Ylfa let out a sob, falling to her knees. Fenrir, please. I did it for you. You did it for yourself, Fenrir corrected coldly. I will not kill you, Ylfa. That would make you a martyr, and you deserve no such honor. He pointed to the gate. You are exiled. You leave tonight. If you are found on Packlands by sunrise, you will be hunted down as a rogue. No, Ylfa screamed, reaching out to him. You can't. I'm a high blood. I have nowhere to go. You should have thought of that before you lit the match, Fenrir said. He nodded to the warriors. Get her out of my sight. As Ylfa was dragged screaming from the courtyard, the sound of her desperate pleas fading into the night, a heavy silence settled over the pack. Fenrir sank back into the chair, his energy spent. He looked up at the crowd. It is over. Go to your homes. We rebuild tomorrow. But no one moved. Slowly, awkwardly at first, Hati stepped forward from the crowd. He looked at his brother, then at Zella. He saw the burns on her hands, the soot on her face, and the fierce way she stood by the Alpha's side. He bowed his head. A deep, respectful incline that he held for a long moment. Then Astra did the same. Then Elder Randell. Then Rudina. One by one, the entire pack bowed, not just to the king, but to the woman standing beside him. Zella watched them, her throat tight. They weren't looking through her anymore. They were seeing her, and for the first time in her life, the gaze of the pack didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a foundation. Fenrir squeezed her hand, pulling her attention back to him. "Let's go home, Zella," he whispered. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Let's go home." As the healers moved in to take Fenrir to the infirmary, Zella walked beside him, her head high. The fire had taken everything from the forest, but it had given her something far more valuable in return. It had given her a crown, and tomorrow, she would have to fight to keep it. Chapter 7. 3 days had passed since the fire. The infirmary was quiet, filled with the sharp medicinal smell of antiseptic and the soft hum of machinery monitoring the alpha's vitals. Zella sat in the chair beside the bed, her hands resting in her lap. The bandages on her palms were fresh, white starkness against her dark tactical pants. She traced the line of the sheet covering Fenrir's legs. The healers said he would walk again, run again, but the bone-mending process was grueling, requiring him to remain sedated for long stretches to allow his accelerated healing to knit the crushed femur and tibia back together. Fenrir shifted in his sleep, a low groan escaping his lips. Zella reached out, brushing a strand of dark hair from his forehead. His skin was cool now, the fever from the infection having broken the night before. "I'm here," she whispered, a mantra she had repeated 1,000 times in the last 72 hours. The heavy oak door of the private room creaked open. Zella stiffened, turning in the chair. She expected Astra or a healer. Instead, she found a young beta messenger, clutching a scroll with a wax seal. He looked terrified, his eyes darting from the sleeping alpha to Zella. "Zella?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Yes?" "The Council of Elders requests your presence," he said, extending the scroll. "Immediately, in the high chamber." Zella took the scroll, her heart sinking. The high chamber. That wasn't a place for casual chats. That was where laws were written and sentences were passed. It was where the pack's destiny was steered. "Is Fenrir aware of this?" she asked, looking back at him. "No," the messenger said quickly. "Elder Rudina was specific. He wishes to speak with you alone." Of course he did. Rudina had lost his daughter to exile because of Zella. He couldn't overturn Fenrir's judgment, but he could certainly make Zella's life a living hell while the Alpha was incapacitated. This was a power play. They were striking while the king was asleep, hoping to intimidate the stray back into the shadows before she could get too comfortable in the light. Zella stood up, smoothing the wrinkles in her shirt. Fear, cold and familiar, tried to coil around her gut, but she shoved it down. She looked at her bandaged hands. She had lifted a burning tree. She had stared down death. A room full of old wolves in velvet robes was not going to break her. "Tell them I'm coming," Zella said, her voice steady. She leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to Fenrir's temple. "Sleep," she murmured. "I'll handle this." She walked out of the infirmary, her boots clicking rhythmically against the stone floor. She didn't rush. She walked with the pace of someone who belonged there. As she passed the nurse's station, she saw Astra entering the hallway. "Zella?" Astra asked, seeing the scroll. "What is that?" "The elders," Zella said, not breaking her stride. "They want a meeting." Astra's eyes narrowed. "I'm coming with you." "No," Zella said, stopping and turning to face the warrior. "If you come, it looks like I need protection. It looks like I'm weak. I need to do this alone, Astra. I need them to see me." Astra hesitated, searching Zella's face. She saw the resolve there, the steel that had been forged in the fire. She nodded once, stepping aside. "Give them hell, Queen." Zella turned and marched toward the heavy double doors at the end of the corridor, ready to face the lions in their den. The high chamber was designed to make you feel small. The ceiling soared 30 feet high, lost in shadows. While the walls were lined with the skulls of ancient beasts, hunted by the pack's ancestors. In the center of the room sat a semicircular table made of black stone. Behind it sat the 3 remaining elders, Rudina, Randell, and Marcus. Rudina looked 10 years older than he had 3 days ago. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollowed by the shame of his daughter's treason. But grief had hardened him, turning him brittle and sharp. Randell looked anxious, her fingers drumming on the stone, while Marcus remained a stoic, unreadable statue. Zella walked to the center of the room, stopping at the designated mark on the floor, a circle worn smooth by centuries of petitioners. She didn't bow. She stood tall, meeting Rudina's gaze head-on. "You summoned me," she said. "We did," Rudina said, his voice raspy. "We are here to discuss the future of this pack, specifically the vacuum of power left by my daughter's departure." "There is no vacuum," Zella replied calmly. "Fenrir is the alpha. He rules." "Fenrir is a man," Marcus interjected, his deep voice rumbling. "A man prone to emotion. He has made his intentions regarding you clear. He intends to mate with you, to elevate you." "He already has," Zella said. "A declaration made in the heat of trauma is not a binding legal contract," Rudina snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "Listen to me, girl. You performed a brave act. No one denies that. You saved his life. For that, the pack owes you a debt. We can offer you a comfortable home, a stipend, perhaps a position in the nursery." Zella blinked. "The nursery?" "It is a respectable position," Randell offered gently. "It fits your station." "My station," Zella repeated, a dry laugh escaping her lips. "You're terrified, aren't you? You look at me and you see a disruption. You see dirty blood mixing with the pristine line of the kings." "We see reality," Rudina argued. "The Luna of this pack must be a diplomat, a strategist, a warrior born of strong stock who can produce heirs capable of holding the shift. You are an orphan. Your parents were weak. You struggled to shift until you were 16. If you sit on that throne, the neighboring packs will smell blood in the water. They will attack us, thinking we have gone soft." Zella stepped forward, leaving the circle. "Let them attack. They'll find that the softest-looking wolf is the one who will tear their throat out." She held up her bandaged hands. "You talk about strength like it's a math equation. Like it's something you inherit. But Ilfa had the best bloodline in the pack. She had the training, the status, the breeding. And what did she do? She tried to burn this pack to the ground to soothe her own ego." She lowered her hands, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper that echoed in the silent room. "I didn't save Fenrir because I'm special. I saved him because I know what it's like to be nothing. I know what it's like to be left behind, to be crushed under the weight of this hierarchy. And because I know that pain, I will fight harder than any highborn wolf to make sure no one else feels it. That is what a queen does. She doesn't rule from a pedestal. She rules from the trenches." Rudina stared at her, his mouth slightly open. He looked for the fear he expected to see in a low-born wolf, the deference. He found only fire. "Inspiring words," Marcus said, leaning back. "But words do not change biology. You are forbidden by custom for a reason. Tradition. Tradition nearly killed your king," Zella shouted, her patience snapping. "Tradition blinded you to the snake in your own house. If you choose tradition over survival, then you deserve to fall." The silence that followed was deafening. Zella stood trembling, not with fear, but with the sheer force of her own conviction. She had said it. She had spoken the truth that had been silenced for generations. Rudina narrowed his eyes. "Insolence. Fenrir may be fond of you, but the council has the power to veto a mating if it endangers the pack. And I believe—" The sound of the heavy double doors crashing open cut him off. The doors didn't just open. They slammed against the stone walls with a violence that shook dust from the tapestries. Standing in the entryway, leaning heavily on a wooden crutch but looking more dangerous than a natural disaster, was Fenrir. He wore only loose linen pants, his chest bare and bandaged, his leg encased in a heavy brace. He was sweating, his skin pale, clearly in immense pain from dragging himself out of the infirmary. But his eyes were glowing with a golden fury that made the air in the room vibrate. "Fenrir!" Randell gasped, standing up. "You should be in bed." Fenrir ignored her. He limped into the room, the thud drag of his crutch the only sound. He didn't look at the elders. He looked at Zella. He moved until he was standing beside her, using his free arm to pull her against his side, anchoring her to him. "You held a council meeting," Fenrir said, his voice low and dangerous, "without the Alpha." "We were merely assessing the situation," Rudina stammered, shrinking back into his chair. "We were explaining the customs to the girl." "Her name," Fenrir snarled, "is Zella." He turned his gaze on the three elders, letting his alpha aura flood the room. It was suffocating, a heavy blanket of dominance that made Marcus lower his eyes, and Randell clutch her throat. "I heard you," Fenrir said. "I heard you speak of vetoes, of tradition, of weakness." He released Zella only to turn and face them fully, leaning on his crutch. "Let us speak of tradition. Tradition says the alpha chooses the strongest mate. Tradition says the pack follows the alpha's instinct." He reached out, grabbing Zella's hand again, lacing their fingers together. "This woman lifted the weight of the world off my back. She walked through fire while you sat in your stone tower debating grain stalks. There is no bloodline in our history that carries more strength than what she holds in her spirit." Fenrir took a deep breath, fighting the pain in his leg. "You want to veto? You want to enforce the forbidden laws?" He looked at Zella, his expression softening into pure devotion. "Then you will have to find a new alpha, because I will not lead a pack that does not kneel to her." Rudina gasped. "You would abdicate? For her?" "I would burn this entire hierarchy down for her," Fenrir vowed. "But I don't think I'll have to." He turned to the empty space in the room, projecting his voice. "I, Fenrir, Alpha of the Stone Ridge Pack, claim Zella as my fated mate. I claim her as my queen. I declare that the old laws regarding bloodline status are hereby null and void. From this day forward, rank is earned by deed, not by birth." He looked back at the elders, challenging them to speak. "Does anyone object?" Marcus looked at Rudina. Randell looked at the floor. The sheer force of Fenrir's will, combined with the undeniable truth of Zella's actions, had cornered them. To reject her now would be to reject the Alpha himself. Slowly, Marcus stood up. He bowed his head. "We hear the Alpha. We accept the Luna." Randell followed suit. "We accept the Luna." Rudina sat frozen for a long moment, his legacy crumbling around him. He looked at Zella, really looked at her, and saw the steel in her spine. He realized he had lost. He stood, his movements stiff, and bowed low. "We accept the Luna." Fenrir let out a breath, leaning his weight against Zella. "It is done." They walked out of the pack house together. It was slow going, Fenrir leaning on his crutch and on Zella, but neither of them rushed. The sun was setting, casting the world in a warm, golden haze that softened the harsh lines of the stone buildings. As they stepped onto the main porch, they stopped. The courtyard wasn't empty. The pack was there. Hundreds of wolves, waiting in silence. They had heard the rumors, felt the shift in the air. When they saw Fenrir and Zella emerge, battered, bandaged but standing together, a ripple went through the crowd. At the front of the crowd stood Hati. He looked tired, stripped of his arrogance. When his eyes met Zella's, there was no jealousy left, only a profound regret. He stepped forward, alone. "Brother," Hati said softly. He looked at Zella. "Luna." He went down on one knee, bowing his head in total submission. It was the signal the rest of the pack had been waiting for. Like a wave crashing against the shore, the pack knelt. Warriors, mothers, elders, pups. They all bowed to the orphan girl who had saved their king. Zella's breath hitched. She gripped Fenrir's hand tighter. "They're bowing," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "Not to me," Fenrir said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "To us." They moved through the parting crowd, making their way to the edge of the territory, overlooking the deep woods. The devastation from the fire was stark, acres of blackened earth and charred stumps stretching out toward the river. It was an ugly scar on the land, but as Zella looked closer, she saw it. Near the riverbank, where the fire had burned the hottest, a splash of vibrant green cut through the gray ash. A sapling fed by the nutrient-rich soot was pushing its way toward the sun. "It's ruined," Zella said softly, looking at the charred landscape. "No," Fenrir corrected, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "It's clear. The old rot is gone. Now we can build something new." He turned her to face him, his golden eyes filled with a promise that stretched into forever. "We have a lot of work to do, Zella. The laws need rewriting. The council needs restructuring. It won't be easy." Zella smiled, the expression feeling light and free on her face. She looked at the man who had seen her when she was invisible, the king who had broken the world to keep her. "I don't need easy," she said, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, powerful beat of his heart. "I just need you." Fenrir pulled her close, the wind carrying the scent of rain and new growth over the ridge. The forbidden girl was gone. The invisible orphan was a memory. Standing on the edge of the new world, Zella realized that she had never needed a bloodline to be royal. She just needed the fire to prove that she was gold. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, signaling the end of the old day and the promise of the next, the Alpha King and his queen stood watch over their kingdom, ready to rule.